Good evening, First Assembly. I am Tunisha Hubbard, and I am covering Wednesday Word for our lead pastor, Pastor Wes Johnson. And tonight, we're going to talk about tides. Not tides, like paying tithes, but tides, like that come in at the sea. So, let's dig in. Okay, so tides. So I read up about tides in my preparation for this, and I learned a lot of interesting things. And some of you may know, like I'm sure we've all heard people chatter about high tide and low tide and neap tide and slack tides and spring tides. And it doesn't matter what tides are going on. The tides are always changing, and it is controlled by the moon. And then in some tides, it's the sun helps to determine what the tide is. So within a 24-hour period, there's usually 2 high tides and 2 low tides. And this is true for any 24-hour period, which I thought was extremely interesting. So the tides, they keep going. It goes high, low, and this cycle just continues to go. And it's called NOAA, N-O-A-A, the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Association. They can actually track tides. So they have a tide chart because the moon controls the tides are predictable. So they can chart it out. Now, where it gets interesting is there are a lot of factors that affect the tide. So one of them is the seascape. So the actual shore that will affect, right, the way it's designed, whether it's a bay, so it's cut in, whether it's a big open shore, whether it's a small space, a large space, all of these things affect the tide, right? It'll affect how that tide is experienced, how long it is, and how severe it feels. And then the air pressure affects the tide, right? And this one is an inverse relationship. When the pressure is high, it forces the tide to be low. And when the air pressure is low, it forces the tide to be high. And so if according to the moon, this would already be a high tide, if the pressure is low, then the tide would be that much higher, right? It becomes more severe because the air pressure is pushing down on it. So just keep these things in mind. And then one final factor that we know affects the tide is the wind. So the wind, and now, we can't control the wind, whether the wind blows east, west, north, south, all of that will affect the tide. And so now NOAA, they'll put out a tide chart, but then they'll tell you that you have to go to your local tide chart because what is going on in your local area is affected by all of these other factors, right? So in your area, what is the wind like? What is the atmospheric pressure? What is the shape of the shore? This would all affect, right, whether it's a high tide or low tide, how long the high tide lasts, how the tide is affected. And then tides are good for different things, right? During a high tide, you might go boating because the water is so much higher than the rocks and all of the debris that it would be easy to navigate the oceans. So that's a great time to go boating. And a lot of people go fishing when there's a high tide. And I know some people even track the tides so they know when to go fishing. And then when it's a low tide, you might find that it's easier to explore the ocean, right? Because the water is washed away, right? We get a lot of tide pools. You can see coral reefs. You can see all of the life that is normally underneath the sea. And so this is so what we have to understand is the tide is always changing, right? The tide changes. It's on a cycle. The local factors, the local circumstances affect the tide, and each tide is good for different activities. So you have to know what the tide is in order to know what it makes sense to do. Now, all of this probably makes sense if you are just a person who does a lot of water activities. If you're not, just hang in there with me. And so we're going to talk about this. Now, our lives can kind of look like the way tides work, right? In Ecclesiastes 3, 1 through 8, the Bible talks about the seasons, right? This is a very well-known passage, and it begins with, "To everything there is a season and a time for every purpose under the sun." And then it goes on to say, right, there's a time to live, there's a time to die, there's a time to sow, a time to reap, a time to kill, a time to... And all of this, right? There's a time for war, there's a time for peace. And this is very much like the tides that happen, right? These seasons in our lives, they come and they go. And then there are factors that would affect how we experience them, right? So just like the tide is affected by the shape of the land, our seasons in our lives are affected by the landscape, like our landscape, which would be the condition of our hearts and our relationship with Christ, right? So when our situations start to arise, right, whatever is going on in our heart, it can make our season worse, or it can make it less severe, right? And again, just like the tide, the things that are going on around us will affect how we experience the tide. And the pressures of life, right? Just like the air pressure, the pressures of life will affect what is going on in our seasons, right? It will affect whether everything is more severe. It will affect whether things are lessened. It'll affect how we respond to people during our seasons. And so we have to be aware of ourselves. We have to be aware of what our hearts are like. What is our relationship with Christ? What are the circumstances in our lives that can affect how we are experiencing the things we experience? And then finally, there's the wind, right? In the Bible, one of the very first descriptions of the Spirit of God is ruah. And this Hebrew word means wind, breath, or spirit. So the Spirit of God. And just like the wind affects the tide, the Spirit of God affects how we experience the tides. Now, one of the things about the wind and the tides that is very interesting is when the wind blows, it can change how the tide is experienced. So if there's a high tide, which means that there's a lot of water coming in, if the wind is blowing against it, it can blow it out, and you might think that it's a low tide, right? This is because of what the wind is doing. And it's the same thing. We could be experiencing a situation, and then the Holy Spirit comes in, and he's moving against that situation in such a way that when we start to experience it, we experience it as the opposite of what it is, right? And we've probably all had times like this, right? Something is going on in our lives, and we expect to be angry, but then we find that we're not, right? And that is the work of the Spirit. That's the Spirit blowing against that season, right? That time to be angry, and that is the season. But because the Spirit is there and the Spirit is moving, that whole situation is beginning to be experienced differently. And so this is, we're just saying, now, that is just a parallel. So now we're going to go into the Bible and look at a few examples of just situations that happen and how let's figure out from these situations what a change in the tide might look like and how we can ensure that we are experiencing this to the fullest. So the first one we're going to look at is Luke 5:1-11. And this is where Jesus calls his disciples. Now, the people who are the characters here it's Simon Peter and James and John, the sons of Zebedee, are the ones who are mentioned by name in this story. And so Jesus there's a crowd following him. So he wants to get away. He comes on the shore. He sees two empty boats. He jumps in one of them with Simon Peter, and he says, let's push away from the shore. He teaches from the boat, and then he tells Peter, go out some more and throw your net over. And Peter says, okay, we've been fishing all night and we haven't caught anything, but because you said so, we're going to go ahead and do it. So he throws over his net, and the catch is so big that his nets start to tear. He has to call, I believe it's the sons of Zebedee, to bring their boat. And both of them, their boats are filled now with fish, and the boats are still sinking. And so this is an example of the tide had changed. And one of the things we have to remember about the tide is always changing. We don't always know, right? So Simon Peter had been fishing all night, and he's a fisherman. So he knows that the season for fishing is over. We're going to have to go away and come back, right? And if he is following what I learned about the tides going up and down, right? It's about another 12 hours before we're going to hit another tide where I can fish. But then the Lord says, no, come out, do something different. Do what I'm telling you to do. And then it turns out that the tide had changed. Something had changed, but Peter didn't know. All right, let's go to the next example. We're going to keep that in mind. We'll go to another example, another fishing example. This one is taken from John 21, verses 1 through 14. And at this time, Jesus, this is one of Jesus's appearances after his resurrection. And he appears, the story is being narrated by the disciple who describes himself as the disciple whom Jesus loved. There's Simon Peter, and then there's other disciples who are not named. And so Jesus appears. They are out to sea. He appears on the shore, and he says, hey, have you caught anything? They said, no. And he says, okay, throw your nets on the right side. And they do. And again, the catch is so big that they need help. But this time it says their nets were not breaking. So maybe they learned something from the earlier experience, get stronger nets. And so they get this big catch. And then out of this, right, the disciple who is described as the disciple whom Jesus loved, he turns to Simon Peter and he says, this is the Lord. And so out of this, they get a revelation that this is the Lord. And in the previous example, Simon Peter had said the same thing, right? He realized after they had done this counterintuitive action, they went out further through their nets, and Simon Peter had said, oh my gosh, Lord, I got to get away from you because I am so sinful, right? So his sinfulness was exposed, and he began to realize that Jesus is the Lord. So there's this big revelation. And then we go on. We'll do one more example, and then we'll see what are the similarities that they experienced in these. So the next example is in 1 Kings 17, verses 7 through 24. This is the widow of Zarephath. And in this story, Elijah the prophet, right, he had just declared that there would be no rain. And the Lord tells him, go to Zarephath. I have ordered a widow to take care of you. So he sees her. He asks her to make him some food. She says, look, I'm on my last ingredients. If I make you something, like I was going to go make myself something, for me and my son, or we're going to die. And he says, well, just make me something first, and then you'll make something. And so she does this. Her ingredients never run out. And then later on, her son dies. She goes to the prophet. She says, what have I done? Have you come to live with me so you could expose my sin and bring death on my son? Elijah prays, and her son is raised to life. And then she says, well, now I know that you are truly a man of God and that the truth is within you. And so again, we're seeing that she also got a revelation, right? After all of these things, she got this revelation that like there's something else going on here. And so what we can kind of pull from all three of these examples, right? One of the first things is in each of these stories, the characters are doing exactly what they always do, right? The fishermen are fishing. The widow is cooking, right? Like these are things that she is normally doing when the change of the tide happens. And the change in the tide is so subtle that they don't even realize. They don't realize what is going on until they are told to do something. And it's when they act in faith that they can see the result of it. Then they can experience what the change tide looks like. And in all three cases, this was true. Because in the first example, when Jesus was initially talking to the disciples, they did not know him. They knew that there was a crowd following him, but they did not know him to be the Lord. And he just said, yeah, go on out, throw your nets. And they did it. They obeyed. And that obedience, that act of faith, is the thing that opened up the experience. And then the experience is what opened them up for a deeper revelation of what was going on. And so for us, it's going to be very important that we have to follow, right? We have to understand what the Lord is doing, right? So we're going to make sure that the circumstances in our lives are good. We got to look at our heart. We got to have a relationship with the Lord, and we got to be sensitive to the move of the Spirit. And then once the Lord prompts us to take an action, we have to step out in faith, because this is where the faith is what begins to open things up, right? That obedience is what opens us up to the blessings of the Lord. It opens us up to see something different, to see something beyond where we are. And now, how would we even know? Like, what would this look like in our lives? So we're thinking through this, and it might be something simple, right? Like you're just going through your day, and you're at work, whatever your job is, and just like the fishermen, you get this idea to do something just a little bit differently, right? Instead of casting your nets to the left, you cast it to the right, right? So the Lord might be saying, okay, when you're at work, you're working in your Excel, you know what, how about if you put a column that says this? And then you might find just doing that one little thing opens up something that just changes the direction of your work, changes how much work you have to do. It changes just everything, makes you more productive, saves you some time, gets you some recognition. What if that's just the little things that the Lord is doing? Because we have to remember that the change in the tide is subtle, right? The tide has already changed. And we are not going to know, we are not going to experience it until we begin to take the actions that the Lord wants us to take. And He wants us to take those actions because that gets us from where we are into a place where we are experiencing His mighty hand and into a place where we get a deeper revelation of Him, where we can go deeper in our relationship. But we've got to obey, right? He's brought us this far. He's given us so much, and now it's time for us to take that step. And it could be something very, very small, again, because the shift is subtle. And it might even look like maybe you've had a lot of pressure in your life, right? And then we've learned from the tide, right? When the pressure is high, the tide gets low. And when the tide gets low, this is a great time to explore. This is a time when things that are beneath the surface get exposed. And maybe that's where we are. And if that's where we are, we just have to lean into it. We have to look into this thing, look at what is beneath our surface, look at what the Lord is showing to us. What do we need to change? What do we need to keep? What do we need to just modify just a little bit in order to get to where the Lord wants us to be, so we can get to the place where we are experiencing this new thing that the Lord has in store for us. And we know that He does, because every good and perfect gift comes from God, and He has good gifts for us. He's just waiting for us to step in there and take hold of them. And then it might feel like, maybe you just feel like that you have to leave some things, some habits, perhaps even some people behind, and you just have to make a different choice. Maybe that's what it is. And it might feel like something big, or it might feel like something really small. But let's just start. Let's start taking those actions. Let's start walking it out so that we can step into what the Lord has for us. So again, the tide has already changed. When we look at the world, we look at what's going on in the world, and we know what the Lord promises. We understand that as children of the King, that we are secure. We know that what He has for us is good. And if we are not experiencing that, now that does not mean that you will never have issues, because even in one of these examples, right, they got a great catch, but their boat was sinking. Now the boat sinking, that is not a great thing, but that does not mean that they're in the wrong place. So understand me, right? If the tide has changed and it is good for us, but it does not mean that everything is peachy keen and it's just a bed of roses, right? We are still living on the earth. We can experience, we know that all of these things will come. And as we continue to go, the Lord will reveal difficult things to us. He will draw us closer to Him. But the difference is when we're beginning to experience the Lord, because you get that revelation. And when you get that revelation, you understand that all of this is it's just leading us to Christ. It is just pulling us closer to Him. And then we will be encouraged to help others experience what we are experiencing, because this is what it's all about, right? The Lord wants everyone to come to Him. And so let us put ourselves in a position to be able to experience this new changing in the tide. The tide has turned. Put yourself in the position to experience it. We will be happy to have you come out and worship with us. We worship every Sunday morning at 10:30. We have Sunday school for adults and children at 9:15, and then we have our in-person Wednesday night Bible study. So if you want to get into more discussions about the things that we're talking about on Wednesday, come on out on a Wednesday night and join us. Have a blessed week, and don't forget to tell someone about Jesus.